I never expected a piece of paper to make my blood boil. There it was, bright red and impossible to ignore, stuck to my Aunt Elena's front door like a slap in the face. The word violation screamed across the top in bold letters. I had only been gone for 2 hours, getting her groceries and picking up her prescribed medication. My hands shook as I read it. The HOA was demanding we remove the wheelchair ramp we had installed last month after her stroke. The same ramp that finally let her come home from the hospital. The same ramp that gave her back a piece of her freedom. And now, they wanted it gone in 48 hours, or her monthly fees would triple. I found my aunt in her study, surrounded by the law books she had used during her 30 years as a judge. She hadn't changed out of her morning robe yet. These days, even simple tasks took longer. When I showed her the notice, she adjusted her reading glasses and studied it with the same calm focus I had seen her use in countless family arguments. Victoria Winters. She read the signature at the bottom. Interesting timing, isn't it? The day after she becomes HOA president. Her voice was steady, but I could see the concern around her eyes. A knock at the door made us both jump. It was Mrs. Chun from next door, leaning heavily on her walker, tears streaking her cheeks. "They're doing it again," she whispered, clutching a similar red notice. "First my medical supply storage, now this. I can't afford these new fees. I'll have to move." My aunt wheeled herself forward, reaching for Mrs. Chen's shaking hands. That's when we heard the clicking sound outside. Through the window, I spotted Victoria Winters in her spotless white pantsuit, taking photos of both our houses with her high-end camera. She looked like a predator circling its prey, perfectly composed and proud of her authority. I started toward the door, ready to confront her, but Aunt Eleanor's voice stopped me. "Wait," she said, pulling out her old leather notebook. "First we document, then we plan." She began writing, her hands steady despite everything. "Tell me exactly when you got your first notice, Mrs. Chun, and do you still have copies?" As Mrs. Chun began her story, more neighbors started calling. The Patel's son couldn't park his disability van anymore. The John's daughter with cerebral palsy was cited for her therapy equipment being visible from the street. Each call revealed another piece of a troubling pattern. I watched my aunt's expression shift as she listened, taking detailed notes. The concern in her eyes vanished, replaced by something I hadn't seen since her stroke. That determined look that had made lawyers nervous in her courtroom. She turned to her computer and began typing. "Get my old case files from the garage," she said, not looking up. "The ones marked housing discrimination. And call Robert from the ADA compliance office. Tell him Judge Montgomery needs a favor." Victoria Winters had no idea what she had just started. She thought she was targeting a helpless old woman in a wheelchair. But as I watched my aunt pull up property records and legal documents, I realized Victoria had just picked a fight with the wrong judge. The real question was, how many other disabled residents had Victoria harassed before she reached our neighborhood? And why did she seem so focused on getting us all to leave? I glanced out the window again. Victoria was now talking to a man in an expensive suit, gesturing at our houses while checking something on her tablet. When she caught me watching, she gave a smile that sent chills down my spine. Something told me this was about more than just wheelchair ramps and property values. And my aunt, that brilliant, unstoppable force of justice, was already 3 steps ahead in a game Victoria didn't even know she was playing. I knew Victoria was trouble when I spotted her taking photos of Mrs. Chun struggling with her walker in her own front yard. She wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was documenting, targeting, and preparing to make life miserable for those she deemed unfit for her community. My aunt watched from the window, her expression neutral, but I knew that calm meant she was already strategizing. "We need to gather evidence," she said, tapping her notebook. "This isn't just about us. If she's gone this far, she's done it before." I spent the rest of the day going through my aunt's legal archives, pulling out past cases related to housing discrimination and disability rights. Meanwhile, my aunt called an old friend from the ADA compliance office, explaining what was happening. The moment I started digging through the HOA's records, things got interesting. The HOA had been quietly raising fees for disabled residents, citing property upgrades that never actually happened. They had also issued more violation notices to homeowners with medical modifications than any other group. This wasn't just harassment. This was a deliberate effort to push them out. My phone buzzed. It was Mark, a neighbor whose wife used a mobility scooter. "Chief," he texted, "I got a notice for our wheelchair lift. They're saying it's an unauthorized structure and needs to be removed." My grip tightened around my phone. That was it. Victoria had gone too far. I walked back into the study, where my aunt was still on the phone. Her expression shifted when she saw my face. "What happened?" she asked, voice sharp. "They're trying to force out disabled residents," I said, my voice filled with anger. "And they're using legal loopholes to do it." My aunt exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then it's time we close those loopholes." She pulled up the HOA's bylaws, scanning the fine print. There's always a weakness, always a way to fight back. She clicked on a section labeled Accessibility Modifications. A slow smile spread across her face. "Got you," she muttered. "This rule here, this makes everything they're doing illegal." I looked at the screen, reading over her shoulder. If what she had found was correct, Victoria and her associates were about to have a major problem. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was disability discrimination, and my aunt knew exactly how to take it down. I spent the next morning gathering every violation notice, financial statement, and complaint I could find. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Victoria wasn't just enforcing regulations. She was selectively targeting homeowners with medical needs. My aunt had already forwarded our findings to the ADA compliance office, but we needed more proof. If we were going to stop Victoria, we had to make sure every decision she made was exposed. I knocked on Mrs. Chin's door, and she greeted me with tired eyes. I asked her if she had any old notices or documents from the HOA. She hesitated, then led me to a small cabinet, pulling out a folder filled with letters, fines, and HOA memos. I flipped through the pages, my anger rising as I saw the same pattern. Unfair fines, increased fees, and impossible demands on anyone needing special accommodations. Back at my aunt's house, I found her sitting at her desk, her glasses perched on her nose as she examined a legal document. She looked up as I entered, gesturing to the screen. "I found a case from 3 years ago," she said. "A nearly identical situation in another neighborhood. Same management, same HOA president. Victoria did this before." My stomach tightened. That means she's got a pattern. We need to find out how many neighborhoods she's pulled this in. My aunt nodded, picking up her phone. "I'll call an investigator I trust. Meanwhile, you need to get statements from as many residents as possible." I agreed, heading out to talk to neighbors. One by one, people started sharing their stories. The Patels have been fined for their wheelchair ramp, even though it was legally approved. The Millers had paid nearly $5,000 in HOA fees just to keep their modified van parked in their own driveway. Every story made my blood boil. I wrote everything down, took photos of every notice, and documented every fine and complaint. By the time I returned home, my aunt had compiled a detailed report, neatly organized with timestamps and legal references. "This isn't just an HOA issue," she said, adjusting her glasses. "This is federal-level discrimination." I sent the file to the ADA office, knowing this was just the beginning. Victoria had spent years bullying people out of their own homes, but this time, she had picked the wrong neighborhood. That night, I stayed up late preparing for the HOA board meeting. My aunt sat across from me, her old notebook open, marking key points we needed to present. "This isn't just about us," she reminded me. "If we take Victoria down, we need to make sure no one else can take her place and continue this abuse." I nodded, organizing the files containing all the evidence we had gathered. By morning, our report was complete. We had documented every violation, every unfair fine, and every attempt to push disabled residents out of the community. As we arrived at the meeting, the tension in the room was palpable. Dozens of residents had shown up, many clutching their own violation notices. Victoria sat at the head of the table, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The moment we walked in, her eyes narrowed. "I see we have an agenda," she said, her voice cool. I stepped forward, placing a thick stack of documents on the table. "Yes, we do," I replied, my voice firm. These are records of unlawful fines, discriminatory practices, and financial misconduct under your leadership. The room fell into silence. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. These are just policy enforcement, she said. The rules were clearly stated. My aunt cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses. Actually, under the Fair Housing Act, what you've been doing is illegal. She pulled out a printed document, sliding it across the table. Victoria hesitated before glancing at it. You've been targeting disabled homeowners, issuing excessive fines, and manipulating HOA regulations to push them out. That is a direct violation of federal law. The crowd murmured, and a few people nodded in agreement. Victoria forced a smile. You're misinterpreting the guidelines, she insisted. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. Then how do you explain the financial records? The ones showing a significant increase in fees only for residents with medical modifications? Victoria stiffened, but before she could respond, Mr. Patel stood up. My son has a disability, and you fined us over a ramp that was already approved by city inspectors. Others started voicing their own complaints. Within minutes, the room was filled with frustrated residents, all sharing their experiences. Victoria tried to interject, but her voice was drowned out by the overwhelming opposition. Mr. Jenkins, the HOA vice president, raised his hand. I think we need a vote, he said. The board members glanced at each other, then at the growing pile of evidence on the table. Victoria realized she had lost. Her once unshakable confidence crumbled. One by one, the board members voted in favor of an official investigation. Victoria stood, her face red with anger. This is ridiculous, she hissed. But no one listened. She had finally been exposed. The fallout from the meeting was immediate, and Victoria's downfall was only beginning. Within hours, residents flooded the HOA office, demanding refunds for unfair fines and explanations for their increased fees. The HOA board, now under immense pressure, had no choice but to conduct a full audit. My aunt watched the chaos with a calm expression, sipping her tea as if this were just another day in court. Meanwhile, I received a call from the ADA compliance office. Chief, we've reviewed your documents. The violations are severe, and we're launching a formal investigation. I relayed the news to my aunt, who merely nodded. Good. That should put some real pressure on them. Victoria, however, wasn't ready to go quietly. The next morning, a notice was taped to our door. Emergency HOA vote scheduled. We both knew what this meant. She was trying to rally her supporters, hoping to discredit us before we could push for her removal. At the meeting, Victoria walked in with her usual confidence, but this time, her smile wavered as she saw the sheer number of residents in attendance. I'd never seen the community so unified. People who rarely spoke at HOA meetings were now front and center, demanding answers. Mr. Jenkins took the podium first. Due to numerous complaints, we are conducting a review of Ms. Winter's actions. Victoria stepped forward, clutching a clipboard. This is nothing but an attempt to disrupt order in our community. Rules exist for a reason. My aunt, without a hint of hesitation, responded. Laws exist for a reason, too, and you've been violating them. She held up a document, her voice steady. Under federal law, discrimination against disabled individuals in housing regulations is illegal. The ADA Compliance Office has opened a case against this board. The murmurs in the room turned into outrage. Victoria's face turned pale. That's, she stammered, but she had nothing left to say. Mark, the firefighter, stood up. You fined my wife for our wheelchair lift. I want that money back. More voices joined in, each sharing how Victoria had targeted them. The board members, sensing defeat, began whispering amongst themselves. Finally, Mr. Jenkins cleared his throat. Effective immediately, Victoria Winters is suspended pending the investigation. Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, she had lost complete control. My aunt leaned back, her expression satisfied. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made in a courtroom, but in a community finally standing up for itself. Victoria didn't take her suspension well, and it quickly became clear she wasn't going down without a fight. The very next morning, HOA security officers were seen patrolling the neighborhood, issuing fresh notices for minor infractions. One homeowner got cited for a garden gnome, Another was fined for leaving their trash bin out an hour too long. It was a last-ditch effort to exert control, but this time, no one was afraid. Instead of backing down, residents took their fine straight to the HOA office, demanding their removal. When I stepped outside, I saw Victoria standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching as people refused to comply. She caught my eye, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression: uncertainty. The power she had once wielded so easily was slipping through her fingers. Inside my aunt's house, we were finalizing the case files for the ADA investigation. Every piece of evidence was compiled, backed up, and submitted to the appropriate agencies. My aunt, despite her age, worked like a seasoned prosecutor, making sure every legal loophole was closed. A few hours later, we received an official notice. Victoria Winters had been formally removed from her position, pending further review. That evening, as the news spread, the neighborhood celebrated. Homeowners gathered on their lawns, talking, laughing, and sharing their relief. It wasn't just about removing Victoria. It was about taking back their homes. Mark, the firefighter, stopped by with his wife, handing my aunt a small gift. "Just a token of appreciation," he said, "for standing up for all of us." She smiled, setting the box aside. "You all stood up for yourselves," she corrected. "That's what really matters." As the evening wound down, I saw Victoria's house sitting in darkness. No more patrols, no more intimidation. She had spent years bullying people, but in the end, she had no real power. Because power doesn't come from fear. It comes from unity. The next morning, I saw a moving truck pull up in front of Victoria's house. It was the final sign that her rule over the neighborhood was truly over. Boxes were being carried out, furniture was being loaded, and Victoria stood near the driveway, her arms crossed, watching her world collapse. The difference this time was that no one cared. No neighbor stopped to say goodbye. No one offered to help. She had built her power on fear. But once that fear was gone, she had nothing left. My aunt watched from the window, sipping her tea as she observed the downfall of a tyrant. "Poetic justice," she muttered. I stepped outside just as Mark, the firefighter, walked past. He glanced at the truck, then at me, shaking his head. "Can't say I feel bad for her." I nodded, my eyes still on Victoria. She had brought this on herself. The new HOA board had officially reversed every unfair fine, returning thousands of dollars to residents. They also amended the bylaws, ensuring no future board member could abuse their power the way Victoria had. Later that evening, Sarah from next door stopped by with her daughter, holding a small envelope. "We all pitched in," she said, handing it to my aunt. "A thank you for everything you did." My aunt opened it to find a donation made in her name to an accessibility charity. She smiled, a real, genuine smile, and I saw in her eyes the satisfaction of a battle well fought. Victoria had tried to break this community, but in the end, she had made it stronger. As the sun set, the last of Victoria's belongings were packed up, and the moving truck pulled away. She never looked back, and for the first time in months, the neighborhood felt truly at peace. The information in this video is for informational and entertainment purposes only. HOA rules and housing laws vary by location. If you are dealing with unfair HOA practices, consult a legal professional. This story serves as a reminder that power should never be misused. Victoria thought she could control and intimidate people, but in the end, she only united them against her. My aunt always believed in justice, and even in retirement, she proved that one person can make a difference. It wasn't just about winning against an HOA president. It was about showing that communities are stronger when they stand together. HOA rules exist to maintain order, but when they are weaponized, it becomes oppression. If you ever face something similar, don't be afraid to fight back. Because sometimes, the biggest battles aren't fought in courtrooms, but in the very streets where we live. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments. Have you ever dealt with an HOA abusing its power? Share your experience below. Stories like this prove that standing up for what's right makes a difference. My aunt didn't just win against an unfair HOA. She helped restore fairness and justice in our neighborhood. No matter how small the fight may seem, if you know you're right, don't back down. Because sometimes the best way to defeat corruption is by exposing it. Until next time, stay strong, stay aware, and never be afraid to stand up for yourself.